Hello, writing friends. How do you make sure that your novel's plot is gripping? You can start by focusing on conflict, starting when you begin thinking about your two main characters, the protagonist and the antagonist. And that's a big part of what I talk about in this section of my course that I'm sharing with you. The course is How to Plot Your Novel from Idea to First Draft. And I am Lisa M. Lilly, LM Lilly, when I'm writing nonfiction books for writers. If you want to check out the complete course, there is a link to it below. You can also download free story structure worksheets to help you sort out the plot and main characters of your novel. And there is a link to download those free below as well. Thanks so much for watching and good luck with your writing. Hello, and welcome to part one of the How to Write Your Novel Characters section of the course. In this section, we'll talk about the various characters that populate your novel, starting with the protagonist and antagonist. In the next part, I'll cover each of their allies, subplot characters, others who oppose the main characters, any side characters that we need to round out certain plots and play certain roles, and what I think of as walk-on characters, the ones who generally aren't named, but we still need them to help us move through the plot or sometimes bring out the other characters. The protagonist is your main character. Sometimes, if a story, whether it's a TV episode or a novel or a film, that isn't working well, it's because we're confused about who the protagonist is. Or, in other words, it's telling too many different stories and we don't know which one is the main one. You can see where there's an issue with this if you look at three factors. A very clear protagonist actively pursues a goal throughout the story, is the main viewpoint character, and has the most at stake. I should talk about this a little more. The protagonist should actively pursue a goal. A passive protagonist, one who more or less waits for things to happen, generally makes for a slow story and one that doesn't grab readers. So whatever kind of book you're writing, whether it leans toward the literary side, whether it's very plot focused, genre fiction, you want an active protagonist, but that is within the confines of who the protagonist is. Just as an example, which probably would make for a dull story, but I teach legal writing at my old law school, so I have law school on my mind. If you have a character who comes in to law school and she has worked for years as a paralegal, she might go in and her doing everything she can could be studying almost all the time that she's not in class, writing extra journal articles and getting extra credit and acing almost every final. And that for her might be active pursuit. She is doing absolutely everything she can. And another character might come into law school with zero work experience. She's never had to write anything in undergrad. Maybe she took a major that was very technical. She barely had to write a paper. And from experience, I'll tell you, writing skills very important in law school. And she doesn't know anything about the law, and maybe she has two kids she has to take care of. Her doing everything she can is not going to be studying every available moment and writing onto three different journals because she has other life responsibilities. But doing everything she can for her might be she gets to every class on time, she finishes every assignment and turns it in. And when she is in class, she is paying the best attention she can. She may not be able to spend tons of hours on law school, but she is still actively pursuing the goal. I'm sure you can think of a more dramatic example, but the idea is it's wherever your character is starting from. For a comic book example, if it's Superman, he needs to be leaping tall buildings in a single bound, multiple times taller and taller buildings. But if your main character is Jimmy Olsen, he doesn't have to leap tall buildings to be actively pursuing the goal because that is not something that he can do. But he does need to be pursuing the story, getting to know the potential interviewees, taking amazing photos, and now he is doing everything that he can do. So, if you want to create a novel where the protagonist is clear and the forward motion is strong, do your best to meet these three factors. Also, your protagonist's life should be hard or it should become hard. You may start with what is often called the protagonist's ordinary life, and perhaps things are going pretty well. At that point, the protagonist might not even be pursuing a goal, though most readers are more engaged if there is something the protagonist wants from the very beginning, even if that changes. But at the very least, if we start out with a nice, happy, content life, very early, the protagonist should encounter trouble. And throughout the story, throughout the novel, the protagonist should face a lot of obstacles. They don't have to be literal mountains, as we have on the screen here, but they should be problems, issues, challenges, relationships that make the protagonist work to get to the goal. I've given this its own slide because it is so important. 99% of the time, there should be only one protagonist, only one character who serves as the protagonist. Now, the protagonist can have a team. I do a podcast, Buffy and the Art of Story. It's all about the show Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And there are many stories within the 7-season show about Buffy's friends, but it is very clearly Buffy and her friends. And the seasons where it is less clear that it is Buffy's show often are the seasons that are the least favorite of fans, partly because we are not focused on a specific protagonist. It's especially challenging if you try to have two very strong storylines with two different characters. The readers don't know who they are supposed to identify with most. Generally, readers really want to root for one specific character. They can root for more than one for sure, but there needs to be a main one that they identify with, which is why we have the protagonist have the most at stake and be the main viewpoint character and actively pursue a goal because that's what keeps readers engaged. Occasionally, you might have a group as a protagonist. I'm sure there is a novel where that's the case somewhere, but it is very challenging to write that way. And if this is your first or even your second novel, I really encourage you to focus on one protagonist, pick one. Other characters can have important stories. We'll get to subplots, and you can have a very well developed subplot, but you want to have one protagonist for your main plot. Now, the antagonist in some ways is easier because, as you'll see here, the antagonist has one job and one job only to oppose the protagonist. And that is why the antagonist can be key to your conflict. If you have a strong antagonist, you are much more likely to have a compelling story and to make your character, your main character, your protagonist, work hard. Usually, a three-dimensional antagonist is more compelling than one that is a sort of cardboard cutout who just throws up roadblocks against the protagonist for no reason but that they are a villain. Now that I've said that, as with everything, there are exceptions. Comic books often just have antagonists who are just plain out villains. This is a mustache twirling villain. We don't know anything except for whatever reason they like to do evil things. So you can for sure do that. Generally speaking, for a novel, though, readers are more engaged if the antagonist has their own very strong motivation, really wants something desperately, just as much as the protagonist wants to reach their goal. The antagonist must want something else, and those two things clash. Or the antagonist should have a very strong reason to be an enemy of the protagonist. With an antagonist, there it is a little easier to have a group or have more than one antagonist, partly because that creates a stronger force against the protagonist, partly because the reader doesn't tend to identify quite as much with the antagonist, so they're a little more willing to split the focus. It is also easier to have as an antagonist a group such as society. Society is a difficult protagonist because we really want, as a reader, to identify with the protagonist, to really feel for that character, that person. And it's harder to get that with a group, to really get that emotional connection. And with an antagonist, it works a little better. So there are many great stories that essentially are a protagonist, often a human being who is struggling or doesn't quite fit in, against society. Even there, though, typically you will have various characters who represent that antagonist so that it is not just a vague sort of idea of society, but you might have multiple characters that stand in and act for society as a whole. The biggest thing to remember, though, is what I have highlighted: one job. The antagonist must oppose the protagonist. You can either start there or end there, but that is something you need to focus on. Now, our strongest conflict in a story is what is called a locked conflict, where the protagonist and antagonist have mutually exclusive goals. You can think of it as a football game. Team A wins or Team B wins. They can't both win. So that is a very strong conflict. Someone has to win, someone has to lose. Now, you don't have to start out there. You could start out somewhere else and they become more opposed. They end up having mutually exclusive goals. It could be that one has a goal, the other's goal is somewhat off to the side of that, but ends up blocking the protagonist anyway. But you ideally do want a situation where both of them cannot win. Though, again, there are stories where that happens, particularly if you think about the romance genre. Often in romance, essentially the protagonist and antagonist start out, they're either far apart, they're enemies, they meet, they don't hit it off, and eventually they fall in love and live happily ever after. In that sense, at the end, they do both win, but they started out with opposing goals. So while they both fall in love and are both happily ever after, along the way, one of their goals had to change, evolve, adjust so that they could be together. The most important questions you can ask yourself about these two characters: what does your protagonist want? And this is desperately want, something they want so much and might take the whole novel to get it. So, what do they want? Why do they want it? Why does it matter? Why is it important? And put another way, what thing happens if they don't get it? And it should be a terrible thing. I have that in parentheses. And that has to do with that idea of the stakes being very high for the protagonist. If what happens if the protagonist, let's say, doesn't get into the college she wants to go to, if all that's going to happen is she goes to her second choice college, that by itself, not high enough stakes, probably not enough to make us really root for and care about this protagonist. But if you add a lot of things to that, if it's her first choice college with a scholarship, and that's the only one that's going to offer her enough to even go to school. So her other option is either no college at all. And there's a reason she really needs to go to college. She absolutely wants to be an architect. So it's something that she cannot do without the degree. And she has loved this since she was a little girl. Maybe you tie it into something very emotional that happened in connection with this learning about building and learning about architecture. Maybe it's a family relationship, something personal where she has desperately wanted to do this whole life. And the only path forward is a particular school, a particular scholarship. Then we've got a little more to work with here. Uh, Biggest stakes are things like death. So if you have a murder mystery, quite often the stakes for your detective, they are risking their life to solve this mystery. What happens if they don't get it? The killer gets away and maybe the protagonist dies. Same questions for the antagonist. What does your antagonist want? Why? And what terrible thing happens if the antagonist doesn't get it? Now, it's okay if you can't answer these questions yet. I'm putting them out there for you to start thinking about them. Now, if you do have answers, go ahead and make notes of that. Fill in the downloadable PDF that comes with this course, or just free write some ideas about it. Another approach to your main characters, and this is not either or, you can do both of these things, is to take what I think of as the checklist approach and start filling in certain traits or background about your protagonist. How does that person look? Or if it's an animal, if it's a robot, what is the appearance, age, work, education, race, ethnicity, family, home life, where do they live? These types of background items can help you formulate who your character is. I tend to shy away from them because I get a little lost in the weeds. And I don't find for me that they lead me to a strong story. And I get caught up in, well, what color eyes does my protagonist have? Well, in the most stories, it really doesn't matter. You might add that later, and it's some very striking trait that helps the reader remember your protagonist or antagonist. But for me, it doesn't generally lead to a story, but it might be a reason why the character really speaks to you or to your reader. So, one exception to what I just said, my current series, a sort of traditional detective mystery series, started because I have long admired a particular series, Sarah Paretsky's V.I. Warshawski series. She wrote the first female private eye set in Chicago, which is where I live, and it's a city I love. And when I moved away briefly, I was very homesick and I read those books and it helped me feel at home. So I had loved these forever. And in the back of my mind, while I was writing, finishing another series, a supernatural thriller series, was the idea that I wanted to write my own female private eye series. Later, I became a lawyer. And after a while, started thinking, oh, it'd be interesting to have a character who is a lawyer, does the kind of law that I do, which is business litigation, and who starts investigating crimes on the side and eventually does this for a living. So I did have a couple background ideas in mind. She would be a woman. Roughly in her early 30s, and she would be a lawyer. And then I had the idea to make her a former child stage actress so that she had that creative side and this backstory where she had worked her whole life and had all these skills I thought would be helpful for a detective. So I did, in that sense, start with some of those background traits. And just as I look for female private investigator novels or women detective novels, so do a lot of readers. You also can use these traits and background items to make life harder for your protagonist. There's a ton of fish out of water stories, someone whose background doesn't fit a particular area of work or a particular living situation, and they're thrown in and they have to learn about this new world. All kinds of aspects could make life harder for that character. The last one I said will influence characters' values, goals, methods, desires. I should probably have said may influence because there is a fair amount of research showing that while Advertisers tend to think of demographics, targeting particular ethnicities, particular ages or genders with certain products. There is as much variation within any one of those groups as there are between the groups. So it can be too much leaning towards stereotypes or tropes to assume that your character will have certain values, will have certain goals, or take certain approaches just because they are a particular race or come from a certain background or are a particular age. So be careful with that, but it still can be valuable to go through these parts of your character's background. I do have some of these categories on the PDF, and please do not feel you have to fill them all in. But if you want to, go ahead. Sometimes that is a way for me to just start sorting through my characters. And while I'm filling that out, other things are going on in my unconscious mind, and I end up often somewhere different than I expected. And that in itself can be helpful. In review for our protagonist, remember the protagonist should actively pursue a goal. We also talked about main point of view characters. So we're seeing through the protagonist's eyes the most often. Now, it doesn't have to be all the time, could be all the time, especially if you write a first person novel that is only from one character's point of view. Generally speaking, then that's your protagonist. Exception, The Great Gatsby, told by Gatsby's neighbor. That's a good example of an exception to every rule. You want to be in the protagonist's point of view most of the time, and the protagonist should have the most at stake, the most to lose if things go badly. Also, life should be hard for the protagonist. I think we've talked about this enough. And ideally, there should be one and only one protagonist. Now to the antagonist. The key thing I want you to remember is the antagonist must oppose the protagonist. If your antagonist is interested in something else entirely or is just going off another direction, that isn't the right antagonist for your story. Now, what do you do if you really are enamored of these two characters, but they are sort of going different directions and you really want them in your novel? Well, perhaps one of them could become a key character in a subplot instead. But if you want these two to be opposite each other, then you'll probably have to either adjust their goals a bit so that they do come into conflict, or create some other reason, some other obstacle to make it so that they are both pursuing their goals and they are opposed to each other. And sometimes that forces you to be more creative when you start with these two characters and you have to figure out how they oppose one another. And keep in mind, the antagonist and protagonist do not have to be aware of each other throughout the book. In murder mysteries, for instance, what I'm writing now, the protagonist knows a killer is out there, but doesn't know who it is, and may very well not cross paths with that antagonist for many parts of the book. All the same, the antagonist is still opposing the protagonist in the sense that the antagonist wants to get away with the murder and the protagonist is determined to solve it. So their goals are mutually exclusive, whether or not they interact with each other very much. For both characters, ask yourself, what do they want? Why does it matter so much? What is the terrible thing that will happen if each of these characters does not get what they want? And as I just alluded to, are the goals mutually exclusive? Don't have to be, but that does make for a very strong conflict. If not mutually exclusive, it should be difficult for them both to reach their goals. And there is the traits and background checklist approach, which you may want to do along with asking these questions. So you can do both. What's next? Part 2 of the character lectures is everybody else in your story. So that tells you how important protagonist and antagonist are. They have their own lecture, and then we'll talk about the other characters. We're going to talk about the main character's allies, because usually both the protagonist and antagonist have friends, supporters, allies, mentors, other characters who help them out. Then there are the characters in your subplots. Most novels, almost all novels, have at least one subplot. And then we have those side characters, the other ones that we need for the various scenes and parts of the story, and the walk on characters. Think of them as extras in a movie or TV show. I'll also talk about the approach of simply developing characters as you write. So you don't need to sort out all of this before you write. You may figure out your characters not by a checklist, not by asking yourself questions, but simply by sitting down and writing. And that is perfectly fine as well. See you in the next part.